Right. Hi there. Thanks for inviting us. Thanks for listening. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about disruption and how and I want to do this. I want to do this in a way that is a little bit personal because obviously I'm behind my years, but I've been in the industry for quite a long time. And one of the things I think, in the media industry in particular, one of the things I think is very interesting is learning from how other companies have disrupted. Because some of the companies I've worked for have been serious disruptors. Some of you, how many people have got Sky in this room? A fair few. You probably don't remember, I'm sure many of you don't remember that Sky was a disruptor once upon a time. A small little company that didn't really know what it was doing and lost a lot of money trying to create this thing called multi-channel television. The idea now in 2017 that we would have multi-channel TV is sort of slightly someone that people just don't think about it. So anyway, I want to talk about this disruption, and I want to talk a little bit about how I think about disruption in terms of what you need to do to be a disruptor and what is the key factors that most of disruptors tend to do. But the first thing I need to, I suppose, introduce IO to you as well, just to ensure, I guess, you understand what we are. Because we are a disruptor, not in an obvious way, perhaps in the same way Sky was, but certainly a disruptor in many areas, because we focus on advertising technology. Well, that's not disruptive. Lots of people do that. The difference with us is that we're doing two things incredibly, very, very differently to the way the market is. One is we're completely and utterly transparent in what we do. Now, you might say, well, again, that's not very disruptive. It is, because we work in a media industry which is completely opaque. And transparency is a really, really important part of what clients are now expecting in their media purchasing. The other area is just the way we've built this company to be diverse and interesting in terms of we want to get a very diverse approach to technology. And relating to the previous speaker, we have a 65-35% split between male and female for a tech company. And it's 55-45 in favour at senior management level. Now, most tech companies rarely get above 10. And I'm very passionate that we can disrupt both tech company, our own industry around the transparency, but also generally tech companies by being much more embracing the market as we need to do. And I'm really proud of that. The other thing, we're based here, that's where our tech is. We're made in the UK, which is a slightly unusual thing because most ad tech businesses are actually started in California or New York. And very few come out of the UK. So we are disrupting in lots of interesting ways. And I'm sure you can talk to the team here who are here or that stand and just find out a little bit more. So let's talk about disruption. And there's three key things, I think, that drive disruption. And this is a Steve Jobs quote. Now, I was lucky enough to work for Apple for 3.5 years. Sadly, not while Steve Jobs was alive, but his presence is very pertinent across that company, as you might expect. And I think the key thing is always one of passion. If you want to be a disruptor, you cannot not believe 100% in what you're doing, regardless of what the world is telling you. And let me tell you a story. So I set up a company, a small little company that was working in digital, and its ambition was to work with football clubs to help them commercialize their websites. And this was back in about 2002. And I rang a friend of mine who's commercial director of Arsenal Football Club, and he's a good guy, and he turned around to me and said, "You're mad, your concept will never work." 4 years later, he was our last customer the day before we sold that business to Sky. And though our team were completely committed to getting that vision and driving that vision, because that's how we got there. Everyone told us it wasn't going to work. Everyone told me when I joined Sky it wasn't going to work. Imagine ringing my dad. I come out of university. It was of the late 80s. The big changes in the industry had happened in all sorts of areas, particularly in the city. So my dad wanted me to get a job in banking, which I did for a year. Not recommended, not for me anyway. And I got out and I rang him up and said, I'm going to go and join this company called Sky Channel. And he turned around and went, why is anyone going to need more channels than we currently have? And we had 4 then. And I said, Dad, I think it's going to work. And he said, okay. He's now an avid Sky Sports fan, but that's another issue. But the points of these stories is I think that you have to have that commitment to the idea. You can't waver from it, because if you do waver from it, then you'll end up giving yourself a lot of perhaps complications, or be guided by the majority. And being guided by the majority is always a challenge. So always have that passion and always stick to it. And ultimately that comes down to live and breathe it. I've worked in various companies where I think sometimes people start off with a great passion and then they think they can go somewhere else and they can do something else. You have to be very careful with that, because if you're living and breathing what you're doing, you shouldn't try and get too far ahead of yourself or too far distracted. Your ambition should be clear. You can iterate, you can pivot, you can do lots of things, but don't get too distracted. Various companies I've come across in my time started off with a really great, clear focus, and then somewhere on the line thought they could do something else, and they lost their core focus, and then someone came into the market and disrupted them. And disruption is going to happen to everybody. Sky disrupted the TV market in a way that ITV and others did not anticipate. I remember talking to ITV executives when I was at Sky, and they said, have you got any audience yet? That was a couple of weeks before Sky bid for the Premier League, and their business changed massively. So you've always got to keep focused, you've always got to keep living and breathing it, and you've always got to forge your own path. The majority generally, in my experience, do not see the next bounce of the ball. And I'd highly recommend, if anyone's interested in entrepreneurship, there's a book by Ronald Cohen, who is the guy who founded Apax Partners, one of the early VC companies. And it's called Second Bounce of the Ball. And his whole principle of great entrepreneurship and disruptors is they're the people who can see the next bounce of the ball, not the first bounce. And it's hugely powerful, because I think it's a great way of thinking about where you're going. And you don't have to be the first. You just need to work out where the market's going to be. Mark Zuckerberg was not the first with social media platforms. He just happened to be the best at working out how to commercialize it and how to scale it. And the whole process that went with it. Apple were not the first people with MP3 players. They were certainly quite late in market, but they were the best people in terms of marketing it and turning it into a great user experience. You know, in even Apple, the key thing always is about customer experience. That's the thing that drives that business. And generally, they do a pretty good job at it. So living and breathing it and staying with it, and that culture that goes with it, is really important. You have to have people who are in your team who've got the same vision. If they don't have the same vision, then it's a bit of a challenge. The other thing is, second thing, which I think is really important, and increasingly now, but even back when Sky first launched, get the tech right. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, if you take Sky was not really a technology company, but one of the things that was really difficult for Sky is it had to transmit its broadcast via satellite. And the first thing they looked at was, right, we're going to do it by satellite. What's the best way of doing satellite? And this is a bit of an unknown story about Sky. But they looked at various different options, one of which their competitor at the time, there was a competitor to Sky at the time called PSB, had decided that they wanted to use first-generation technology, and they were going to launch with first-generation technology and own their own satellite distribution platform, i.e. buy their own satellites. A rather crazy concept, because it cost them something in the region of 600 million. And if you put that in context, that's about 1987. That's a very big investment. Sky took a different view, a really interesting view. They said, okay, we want to go with sixth or seventh generation technology, i.e. technology that we know that works, and we're just going to keep the distribution channels as cheap as possible. So they did their deal with Alan Sugar, they created Amstrad did the dishes, and they used a satellite that existed in the system already, which was run by Eutelsat, and the rest is history. So they got the tech right, and then they focused on the other distribution and everything else that went there. There was a lot of pushback against satellite dishes at the early stages of Sky. Of course there were, because they weren't very attractive relative to what had been there before, but it happened and it worked. So getting the tech right was very important for them. Very important for Facebook, very important for Google, is all of those things. And the thing that was always the case with tech is it's never perfect. No matter what you want to do or what you say, it was always need lots and lots of iterations. So never believe that you've got the perfect solution, because if you have, you're in a different place. So the tech is a really core part of anything. That doesn't mean to say the tech has to be massively complicated. It has to do too many things just yet. It just needs to be right for the audience that you're delivering to and what you're disrupting. So that's point 2, get the tech right. Point 3 is about proof points. And I think the thing that often happens in technology is that people don't always think about what all their proof points could be. What are the things that are going to make this a success? I mean, I remember in the early days when I was working as a media buyer years ago, and Facebook had just pretty much launched. Facebook, actually, its main proof points at the time was about audience. It wasn't about revenue. Their view, which was a very Silicon Valley view at the time, was build the audience and the revenue will come, which is a very disruptive model in many ways, because previously, especially even through the dot-com boom, revenues were always much more important than audience size at that stage. And over time, obviously, they've now built a fantastic revenue machine. But their view was get the audience numbers and then go from there. And then they worked with the advertisers to work it out. They also didn't have a particular view on where advertising fitted on the platform, and that was something that they also evolved. But again, the proof point wasn't that. They were just looking for this. The starting point was audience. Same was true of Google. Google's whole approach, I think, was very, very driven by a great user experience. That was their proof point, and the number of searches and queries that they could create. The advertising thing was slightly secondary, but once it worked, and then it moved on. So always look for great proof points. And be prepared, I think, if you're a disruptor, to understand what those proof points might change to over time. We have various proof points in our business, but I know that they're not going to be the same next week as they were last week. But you have to keep on iterating and keep on understanding what's working. The key thing, I think, especially in this technology age we're now in, is obviously consumers and consumers' reaction to whatever. If you're building an app, how many people are using the app, how long they're using it for, all that type of stuff is really important proof points. But you also have to recognize, perhaps when you're launching an app, that some of the people who'll be on your app in the early stages may not be the people that you're going to have long-term relationships with. And therefore, they may have a different behavior set. So therefore, your proof points may need to change. So always think about proof points as a disruptor, because that's the thing that matters. And whether those and also you can use those proof points to prove that you are disrupting. Sky's whole premise back in the late 80s was the number of dishes it sold. That was the big thing that it focused on. Again, a very similar model to Facebook, actually. Its monetization came secondary to its distribution. And again, if you look at the app ecosystem, and I remember when I was working with the iTunes team, the main thing that operated there was, again, distribution first, monetization second. Now, that's obviously a challenge sometimes, especially when you've got a commercial model to go with it. But if you look at, something like King.com, how many people play Candy Crush here? I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. Most people are aware of Candy Crush as a product, right? One of the most successful apps ever built. The interesting thing with King is that they pivoted their business. They started as a casual games business in the early 2000s, and nearly, I think, weren't successful. But they pivoted their business when they saw this opportunity in apps, and they developed their apps to such a stage where Candy Crush is now, I think, played by some 100 million people a day or something crazy. I can't remember the number. And I think the interesting thing with that is they had a very clear proof point element. So they were looking at proof points as they were building the iOS, in terms of their iOS apps and their Android apps, in terms of how many users they had, all that type of stuff. Monetization for them came secondary. Now there's a lot of monetization. They monetize through advertising. They monetize through in-app purchases. So that countdown to say, can you get up to do this? Can you want to up a level? pay for this type of stuff. But all of those things weren't really available to them when they first launched their iOS proposition. But I think their point was that they focused clearly on audience, and they clearly built the audience, and then then the monetization was come. And I think that makes a sort of interesting model. So those are the proof point. That's the proof point elements. So I think keep clear to your vision, manage your look at your proof points, and get the tech right. Because those are the three things that great disruptive businesses have done consistently over the last 20 or 30 years. And what I think the great thing is there will be more companies who will disrupt. Just because there's lots of very big businesses out there that have very big, strong audience plays, someone will disrupt Facebook, someone. Maybe it's that person's in this room. Someone's going to disrupt Apple in ways that Apple probably haven't anticipated. But the one thing about the good companies is that they will always think about it in the future. And those big companies, I seem to remember when I was at Sky, there was like they had a 10-year plan in terms of where technology was going. So if you do become successful and you are disrupting, you have to keep on thinking ahead because you're going to get disrupted by somebody. And Sky's biggest threat, or Apple's biggest threat, maybe is content and how content's distributed, and Netflix and all those other companies. So we'll see how that disruptive group disrupts the disruptors. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I'm around if anyone wants to have a chat. But it's been a pleasure being here. It's a pleasure to support Digital Plymouth. Thank you.